Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore the many ways people build and define family. In today's episode, we're going to be talking to Tom Webb, and Tom has created a documentary for us called The Easy Bit, in which he interviews men who have gone through fertility treatments with their partners and the male experience of infertility. We have had guests speak about this a little bit in the past, namely Suman from season 1, but I think it is really important that the male perspective is often just not as present in the fertility conversations and the family building conversations as I think it needs to be. And Tom spends a lot of time with his personal journey exploring what family building means to him, and through the lens, the literal camera lens of his documentary, exploring maleness and how fertility may impact maleness. This is a really interesting listen. I found it fascinating not only because the healthcare systems in the US and the UK are so different, but also because Tom and his wife have a really, really interesting and very tough journey that he'll describe to you today. I hope you take a listen. I hope you love this episode and share it with friends. And I hope you take a listen or a watch of his documentary, The Easy Bit, because I think it's really special. Here's Tom. Welcome. I'm so thrilled to have you here today.
Yeah, it's really great to be on the show. I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, Tom, before we get started, can you introduce yourself quickly to our audience?
Yeah, so I'm Tom Webb, and I'm the director of a documentary called The Easy Bit, and it's about what it's like for men to go through fertility treatment, mostly concentrating on the emotional experiences that they go through. And yeah, it came about because of my own personal journey through the world of infertility.
I'm excited to dive into that story. And I'm really excited because as I've been on my own journey and as I've been creating this podcast, one of the things I'm noticing is the overwhelming female voices in the space to talk about fertility and to talk about family building. And it really concerns me that there's this other side of the story that often gets untold. In fact, since I've launched this podcast, several people have confidentially reached out to me and said, thank you. Let me tell you about my own struggles. Please don't tell anyone, but let me share. And it's nice to hear other stories because I feel a sense of connection. And so finding you and finding The Easy Bit was so exciting to me because here you are giving voice to those people who are kind of voiceless in this very big community of people talking about fertility.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what spurred it all off in the first place. Like my wife and I have been going through it for a very long time, and we were at the height of it 5 years ago. And there was honestly, like, you know, we wrote a blog and we had a Twitter account, and there, like you said, there was this huge community of support for my wife and the women going through it. And, you know, and it was really great to see that. You know, it's a fantastically supportive community. And I think it's one of the, you know, it's something that's really embracing social media and it's really working well. But there were so few men. Like, I can't, looking back now, I can think of maybe only possibly one other Twitter account that was around at that time. Or yeah, it was very apparent that there was a lack of that voice.
Well, that's great. I'd love to start at the beginning and hear a little bit about your path to where you are now, which is the director of a film called The Easy Bit. Can you share a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, I mean, going all the way back to the beginning would be about 15 years ago now. So my wife and I, we were sort of in our mid-20s, and, you know, we were very sort of committed to each other, and we decided that, you know, we weren't married at that point, but we knew we'd want to get married. And, you know, so we decided to, let's say, not actively try, but not actively prevent. So we sort of stopped using contraception and that kind of stuff. In
the US, we call that pulling the goalie, which is a soccer term or a football term in your framework. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's perfect. 100% accurate. Yeah, so time went past and we kind of figured that it wouldn't necessarily happen immediately. But after a while, we were like, well, you know, we would have thought something might have, you know, there would have been some indication of something by now. So we started to go and have some investigations, and I did a semen sample and that seemed okay. My wife did all the various initial tests that they do, and all of those seemed kind of okay. So they kind of said, oh, we have what we'd class as unexplained infertility, but you're both quite young. So kept trying. And then we went and saw a consultant, and he sat us down and told us that, you know, your results are coming back. There's nothing wrong. You might just need a little helping hand. So IVF is going to be the easiest thing. You just need to meet the criteria.
And Tom, what was your mental or emotional state at the time? Was it sort of like, okay, we'll just roll with the punches, or were you starting to get concerned?
I mean, for me personally, I was just like, oh yeah, that's fine. You know, I didn't, at no point at that then was I like, we won't necessarily be able to have children or not, because they were so reassuring about the fact that if they'd found something specific with one of us or both of us, then I would have probably, you know, been a bit more concerned. But because they didn't, and all the tests were coming back fine. And, you know, in the UK, obviously, we have the NHS. So, like, it's not something that we necessarily have to pay for.
For those of us in the US, that funding, the fact that you can go through this process without worrying about the finances, just
Yes.
worrying about the medical component and worrying about your emotional state is a game changer.
You know, whenever I see anything about, you know, medicine in the US, it just boggles my mind. Like, I've got friends in the US and they're just like, this is how much it costs me to have a baby. And I'm just like, how is that? And, you know, I just don't understand it. But in the UK, you have to meet criteria to get the funding. So you do have to jump through some hoops. And it's things like certain levels of FSH hormone in the women. And I can't remember what some of the others are. You have to go through certain tests to make sure that you fall within certain criteria. But one of them is BMI, body mass index.
Oh.
Something in the UK, weight is always seen as quite an issue when it comes to medical things. Like, there's a big thing about it. And at the time, my wife was quite big, but she's also quite short. So BMI is something that really does not work in her favour. And we were in this meeting and it was all really positive and brilliant. Like, you're both kind of okay. Let's, you know, we can do this IVF and it'll work and it'll be perfect. It'll be fine. And then the consultant turned to my wife and said, and he literally said, but you're too fat to qualify. So go away and lose some weight and come back when you're skinny.
Oh my God. I'm just going to pause for a second because I've had similar experiences, not that bad, with certain doctors. And it's amazing to me that certain medical professionals in this space, specifically the fertility and OBGYN space, can be, they're dealing with very raw emotions and they can be so inconsiderate on occasion with things like body weight.
Yeah, and you know, there are reasons behind people's body weight. It's not just a simple fact of eating too much. You know, there's other things to consider. So there was no thought about her mental health. There was no thought about what that could have meant to her saying something like that. And of course, it took a problem that was it was kind of a shared problem, but it kind of dumped it all onto her in a really unfair way. It was horrible to watch, because then she then has to take on the mantle of meeting these criteria. And because of my results, I didn't. And it was a very horrible thing. So she spent a lot of time trying to lose the weight. But because she was so little, the BMI calculation for her it's a terrible calculation, because if you're at the extremes of the height chart, it just doesn't take into account. I mean, if you take like rugby players in the UK or American football players in the US, they're probably like classed as morbidly obese. Because of their muscle mass and their height, when clearly they're not. They're healthy, but they are heavy. So yeah, that was like the first sort of hurdle in our way. She worked so hard, dieting and exercising. It got to the point where she got really close. So we started all this in around 2005. By 2010, she'd managed to lose a fair chunk of weight. We still didn't qualify for the IVF, but we fell pregnant naturally, which was a real shock. But we unfortunately miscarried at 10 weeks, which, you know, was devastating. I mean, any miscarriage is a horrible, horrible experience to go through. But in a way, there was kind of a slight element of hope to it that, oh, wait, something did happen.
Right. So when you say hope, are you thinking at least we can maybe try again? Or there's it was because up until that point, there had been no evidence that our genetic material, if you like, would fuse together. And, you know, I think about this a lot, is obviously for my wife, the miscarriage was a very visceral and traumatic experience. And for me, it was a very emotional experience. But I think a lot of the way that I ended up dealing with it or not dealing with it maybe was just clinging on to that ray of like, oh, something happened. And so we kind of kept going, and obviously that set us back a bit. And my wife was really, really like diligently trying to lose the weight and doing really, really well. But it came to a point where, so my wife works for a company that also gave her some private health insurance, as well as we have access to the NHS. And she got a letter through saying they had revised their terms of what that insurance covered. And one of the things that it now covered, well, it didn't cover 100%, but it covered 75% of the cost of gastric bypass surgery. Oh, wow.
So she opted to have a full gastric bypass.
Is there any indication, I'm not a doctor, so I'm curious about how gastric bypass might affect fertility? Because I imagine it's this huge shock to your body.
Yes. To be honest, there is so little evidence about how a gastric bypass affects anything. Like, this is something we've discovered over the last 7 years or so, is that if my wife is having any kind of medical issue, we're just like, oh, could the gastric bypass be affecting that? And nobody knows. So she had that, and I've just realized I'm not sure I know how to translate this into American. Because when we talk about weight for humans, we operate in stone. And I don't think Americans do particularly, do they? They tend to say pounds.
Is it 16 stone?
I know it's 14 pounds to the stone.
14 pounds to the stone.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my wife lost 12 stone.
Which is significant.
Yeah. So we're talking over 100 pounds.
Yeah.
My very rough maths is
very nearly 200 pounds.
Yeah. I don't know the exact figure. She lost that in the space of 12 months.
So what's astounding to me is how extreme this process has been. The impact has been extreme on your wife. It's quite a lot that she's gone through.
I mean, I cannot express the admiration and the awe that I have for her and what she put herself through. The operation she had, so there's lots of different ways they can do the bypass. They can put a balloon into the stomach. They can put a collar around the entrance to the stomach. And all that does is apply a small amount of pressure, and it tricks your body into thinking you're full. But what she opted to have done was where they physically cut the stomach into a small pouch. So her stomach, after they finished the operation, her stomach had a volume of 15 milliliters. So that's, if you take a shot of vodka, that's more than my wife's stomach capacity was immediately after the operation.
I'm dumbfounded. I'm like in utter shock right now. So what's running through my mind as I hear you say this, first of all, is how incredibly painful and dramatic that is. But secondly, she must have really wanted this baby. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a testament to what she would put herself through to do this. And we always knew where our lines were in terms of what we wanted to do. Like, we sort of had ruled out what the options that we would pursue and wouldn't pursue. And, she was willing to put herself through this. And by the time she'd lost all the weight, so normally the government guidelines, or they're called care guidelines in the UK, suggest that the NHS should offer couples 3 rounds of IVF for free. And then if they exceed those 3 rounds, you have to pay privately. The reason they've concluded 3 is because they think that's if it's going to work, it's probably going to work within the first 3.
There's so many statistics that go into these complicated decision making, and it's all, as much as a statistician or a doctor is going to kill me for saying this, but as much as there are statistics to rely on, every story I've heard is in contrast or contrary to those statistics.
Exactly. I often say that it's an incredibly scientific process that has zero control.
Yeah.
And you cannot rely on any success statistics because they've remained the same for 40 years. You cannot judge a clinic by its success rates because those statistics are very, very easily skewed and not necessarily representative. So, we were supposed to qualify for 3 rounds. And I think the month before our paperwork kind of went through, the local area cut the funding down to 2 rounds because there's a group of middle managers who control the money that had that power. So that was a bit of a blow, that we were only going to get 2 opportunities. And then we went so that by this point we were in 2015. And we had 2 rounds, all pretty much back to back, as and they both failed. I think by this point, my sperm analyses were getting worse because, I was 10 years older by this point. So I was 35, and I'm guessing age and stress were the big factors. My lifestyle, I was exercising, and I don't smoke, I don't drink alcohol. So I wasn't doing any of the bad stuff. So I think it was just a factor of age and a factor of stress. So we sort of did those 2 rounds. And then we kind of got into this place where we kind of figured we were going to be childless, not by choice, because we personally couldn't afford to go the private route. So we kind of ended up to the point where we're like, okay, if the IVF doesn't work, then childless, not by choice is the path we're on. We'll be a couple, we're soulmates, and we can have an amazing life together regardless. So we created this plan B, and we drew loads of pictures on a sheet of paper of stuff we would do.
What was on that list? What does a plan B look like for you guys?
It was things like, we love the Formula One Grand Prix. So it'd be like traveling to see the Grand Prix, like countries we'd like to travel to, concerts and bands we'd like to go and see. But then we kind of, the rounds failed and we entered into this kind of, what I kind of look back on now is like the worst part, like probably the most traumatic 6 months, 8 months of my life ever.
That's a huge statement.
Yeah.
What was the trauma? Where was that coming from?
It was just this, I think that's when it sort of hit me, and it was the grief. Because somebody said to me that fertility treatment is like a continual grief. Like from the moment you start it, you're grieving something that you've lost, but you never had it to start with. So you can't move on. It's not like losing a loved one, because you can move on by acknowledging their memory. But with fertility treatment, you're mourning a life that you cannot and will never have.
I've talked about that quite a lot with colleagues and friends, particularly recently in the context of hope. And so frequently there's this emphasis on it will happen, just hold the faith, be positive. And we've been talking about whether that just delays and whether the hope just makes the pain more palatable, because you're always within reach of something and you're always at a loss of something, this So I like what you said, the continual grief.
Yeah, and and I was really sort of struggling with that. And I think it was the worst point for our relationship because I wasn't dealing with it well. I wasn't supporting my wife. So it was really, really tough. And I think my coping mechanisms that I relied on were detrimental to our relationship. So I became very withdrawn. Mm-hmm. For me, balancing my mental health I do it using creative things. Since then, I've kind of got my bearings on it. And obviously I do video production and filmmaking for a job, but I also play like the guitar and the piano, and I keep that as that's my creative hobby. And if I'm feeling really stressed out, I just 10-15 minutes sort of noodling on my guitar.
I think it's so nice to have a creative outlet. I personally have never been a creative person. Work in finance. And this podcast came about because I needed something that would just be a good outlet. I don't think I even realized I was doing that at the time, but in hindsight, it was a nice way of using my brain in a different capacity as I was going through, or as I am going through my own fertility journey. Yeah. So what you're saying resonates with me quite a bit. I'm curious, if you were to do it over, what would supporting your wife look like? And is it possible to support a partner when you're also grieving?
Well, see, that I think is the massive crux of the matter. That, men don't tend to talk about stuff. They tend to bottle stuff up. And that's why we don't see many men talking about fertility issues. It's why we don't see many men talking about mental health. I mean, it's amazing over the last 5 years how things have changed, and things are definitely moving in a more positive direction. And there's a statistic in the UK that 3/4 of all suicides are men.
Oh, gosh.
So there's a massive issue with men's mental health when you look at a statistic like that. And I think that because of the way society portrays masculinity and men and how they are perceived by the world, there's not room for you to ask for help. The whole concept of toxic masculinity, I think, is very prevalent, and I think it's something I think needs to be tackled. And I think it's addressing men's mental health is the first step towards that. And I think if I look back on then, what I probably should have done to support my wife more was I should have got some help. Mm-hmm. Like I probably should have seen a counsellor or a therapist or somebody, so that I had a safe space to talk and vent.
Do you feel like as a result of this journey, you and your wife are closer? Has it built a stronger relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has. It's hard to tell how it's changed us. All I know is it has. There's one of the guys in the documentary, he uses 2 phrases. One is the loss of innocence.
Interesting.
He says the thing that he regrets the most is the fact that the innocence of the life is gone. Like the dream of getting married, having kids, buying a house, like that goes when you get into this infertility, and it kind of opens your eyes a bit to how cruel life can be sometimes. But he also uses the phrase decimation of hope, which is a phenomenal turn of phrase. And I think that's right. When you're in the depths of it, that's how it feels. And I think my wife and I have a very strong relationship now. And, it can really pull you together, but I can equally see how it pushes people apart.
Well, let's turn now to the documentary. I'm really excited to talk about it. And we've already covered some of the themes that you tackle, which is masculinity, fertility, male perspective. You were just getting to the bit where you tell us about how it came to be and the content. So share more.
Yeah. So when we were going through the treatment phase, my wife and I decided to write a blog. And the concept of the blog was that we knew that our friends and family cared and would want to know what was happening, but we also knew that we might not necessarily emotionally want to deal with all of that questioning all the time.
It sounds almost very professional, like, oh, thank you for asking about how I feel right now. Let me refer you to this link over here, and you can see everything you need to know.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of like a bit of a sort of a self-protection thing. And it was during that, I think the biggest eye-opening moment for me, and I promise this will all tie into why the documentary exists, is because we wrote about the first time we went for egg collection. And I don't know if they do it the same in the US, but in the UK, you go in on the same day and the men go and do their sample and the women go and do the egg collection. And it happens within like an hour of each other or less. And I wrote about what it was like for me to be taken by this nurse to a room and sort of talked through the process, and my sort of realization at that moment that this wasn't what I was expecting. And I was pretty honest about what it was like for me, like, you know, then I was like, that's kind of surreal. And then the place we had our treatment is it's an old country house. It's quite a famous one in the UK. And the rooms where the men have to go and do their samples, I think, is technically in the loft area above what would have been the stables. And so it's like this kind of like old door that you go through and up the stairs. And you go into the room, and I kind of described it all. And I was so shocked, went out in the blog, you know, that I kind of said, like, you know, this is the sort of DVDs that were there, and this is like the list of stuff was laminated, and I didn't understand why they needed to laminate a list of instructions. So I was really honest about it all, and it was in the moment when the nurse shut the door that I was like, we're 11 years into this now. If I get this wrong in this moment right now, that's it. It's done. We've lost it. Like, it's like
a lot of pressure.
And it was just like, oh God, how do I now do what I've got to do? So it was this real like realization of like, well, okay, this is not as simple as they'd made it out to be. So I wrote all of that in the blog, and all of the comments we got were from women saying, oh my God, I had no idea. I had no idea my husband felt that pressure. I had no idea that it was so degrading. I had no idea that this is what he was faced with. I made all of these jokes and I said all of these things to him. And there was one lady who's like, I literally just went and apologized to my husband in tears that I'd been so mean to him. Wow. And I was just like, how do people not know this? Like, their partner's not talking about it. They're not communicating, which I can understand. And that was the moment when I just was like, oh, wait, there is none of this information is out there. There's no guys talking about this. And that's when the seed of, okay, maybe there's a documentary in this. It's, you know, making a documentary is something I'd wanted to do for a really long time. And that started to grow and grow and grow. And then when the treatment failed for us, I was like, here's my chance to have a positive ending. I can take this trauma and I can turn it into like a positive thing. I think, you know, it took us a long time to find the guys. So it was from that moment to filming the first interview was probably 18 months.
And was it hard to find the guys because they're just not as readily available in terms of they're not publicly out there in social media in the same way that women are? Or were you asking people and they said no?
Well, first off, it was like, where the hell do I find them? Like, yeah. I just did not know. And I happened to have a couple of conversations and I'd start being more open about it. And the more I mentioned it, the more people would say, oh yeah, that we're going through that. Or I know someone who's been through that.
Yeah.
And
it's this weird secret society almost. I found the same thing with the podcast to some extent, that so many people come out of the woodwork and they say, oh yeah, I want to talk to you about this, but they want to do it one-on-one, which I love and appreciate. It's a very uncomfortable thing to use your voice and articulate your personal experiences for anyone to view or listen to, particularly when you're talking about experiences that are, in the female case, very medical, and a male case involves certain form of self-intimacy that is very awkward to talk about.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think it's a lot of this is taboo, just the issue of masculinity and potentially not being able to father a child, which is traditionally seen as a very masculine thing to do. Yeah. Then, you know, the process of having to provide a sample as well. And then even just guys having to admit that they want kids.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, like, they might not want to admit that they desperately want to have children. So I think there's a lot of reasons why men don't talk about this.
Let's talk about these guys that you're talking to, because you've brought up some really interesting themes around masculinity. What are some of the points of similarity amongst the men that you've interviewed, and what have you learned from them?
So I think the biggest points of similarity is, A, they never expected it unless they knew somebody had gone through it. They didn't necessarily expect it to happen to them. I would say that one of the common themes between all 6 guys is the admiration they have for their partners and just the awe at which they watch them go through the processes they go through. I would say that most of them found it emasculating to some degree.
And emasculating for that reason that you said earlier, which is that men are just expected to produce babies. It's part of, maleness.
Yeah, that's part of it. One of the guys that's really hot on all of that stuff in the documentary is a guy called James D'Souza, and he's a psychology teacher as his day job. And so I think one of his coping mechanisms was to really delve into the if I can't have children, does that really make me a man aspect of it? And he did a lot of soul searching around that. There's a moment in the documentary which I'll talk about. It's a slight spoiler alert, but I'll talk about it. But one of the guys, they were testing to see, like, his results were coming back with azoospermia, so he didn't have any sperm. And one day the clinic said, "Oh, we need you to come in for a blood test because we want to check your genetics, because we're not technically sure if your genetic makeup is technically male." So they're not sure that his chromosome makeup was correct. So he spent, I think it took 12 weeks for them to do the results. So he spent 3 months not really knowing. So he's physically male, in his perception of self male, but then to be told perhaps on a scientific chromosomal level, he might not be male. And that they had to investigate that. So, for one of the guys in the documentary, like, the masculinity aspect of it literally came down to his genetic makeup, possibly.
Right. Isn't it amazing then that we're really talking about all the different layers at which one can feel male? I have never really thought about that before, the identity piece, right? For sure, there's a medical, physical component to a fertility process, and it can be very taxing physically. And then, of course, there's an emotional component. But this self-identity, self-perception component is really fascinating.
Yeah, and I know that with a lot of childless women, that's a big thing. Am I really a woman because I can't have a child? I think it goes both ways.
Yeah.
So that was something that was really eye-opening for me walking into this documentary.
So what other surprises came out of either completing the documentary from a process and personal standpoint, or from the stories that you heard and got to witness? Did you learn anything that you weren't expecting to learn?
Yeah, I mean, when I started out on this, I always envisaged that the reason for making the documentary was so that other guys could watch it and know that they weren't alone, and that it was okay to talk about this stuff, and that they could seek help, and there was something for them, and people understood. The first thing that struck me whilst we were filming it, and that was that I didn't realize it would be a cathartic and positive experience for the men going through it. And when they were on their way home, I would send them a text message and just say, "Are you all right? How do you feel? Do you need any support? Because you've obviously just had to relive something pretty traumatic." And Alamin, who's incredibly eloquent, so when he was on the train coming home, he sent me a message saying it made him realize he'd never spoken about the entire process in one go before. It was a really cathartic experience, and it was the counselling session that he didn't realize he needed. And that really blew me away, because I'm not a trained psychologist, but I did try my best to make sure that the guys were looked after. So, but in terms of other surprises, I didn't expect women to be so shocked by it, and I didn't expect the clinical world to be so shocked by it once they saw it.
Shocked how? So I'm loving this conversation because I'm getting a perspective that is totally foreign to me for 2 reasons. One, I am female, and 2, I'm going through this process without a partner. So I don't have somebody sharing that component with me. But the word shock is a very powerful word. Tell me about that.
I think what it comes down to is for the women, it's a realization of how much the men are keeping from them. And it's not keeping stuff from them because that's a form of protection, as opposed to, normally if someone is hiding something from you, it might be a lack of trust, or there might be a malicious reason for it. But in this instance, it will be down to the fact that they care so much they don't want to burden the other person with that. But, that has a flip side to it that I don't think a lot of guys realize, is that by hiding that, you're coming off as cold and disinterested, which can put, and there's such a fine line to walk as to how much you open up to your partner going through treatment, because obviously incredibly volatile due to all of the hormone treatments and things like that. So, you know, you genuinely don't want to add to that because it's hard enough as it is. But at the same time, you've got to show that you care, and you've got to show that you are in it just as much. And finding the line and then coping with your own emotions can be very tricky and difficult. And I think that's where guys kind of often fall down, is they might misjudge that.
Sounds like such an unfair expectation from a male partner. You know, you must have your own emotional experience, and yet don't communicate that experience in a way that might trigger or poke my emotional experience. And I believe that what you're telling me is these guys chose that or put that on themselves as their own responsibility.
Yeah, I don't for 1 second think that any woman out there would intentionally put that on their partner. It's put on you a lot by the medical staff. They might just turn to you and say, make sure you're doing everything you can looking after your wife. And that's kind of the job. And that's what all your friends and family would say. Like, you know, my wife would talk about all of the medical procedures, and people would turn to me and they would say either something like, you've got the easy bit, referring to giving a sample, or look after her, make sure you're looking after her.
That's so unfair. You know? That's such an unfair expectation.
Yeah. And it's so from the guy's point of view, you know, when your wife is going through these horrifically invasive procedures, these are horrible hormone treatments, like the person most men would turn to for that support and that love would be that woman. So where do you go with that? Because men are told not to talk and not to seek help. You might have that one person you confide in, and then technically you can't. So what do you do with that? And that's why I often say, I think if the men are supported more by the clinics and by psychologists or by therapists or by the industry, that will actually be very beneficial for the women.
For the couple, yeah.
Yeah.
And you also said that the clinical staff or the medical community was shocked by some of the things that were communicated. Are you talking about that point, that here's the way in which you in the medical community can step up and better support both partners? Or was there something else shocking?
Just the fact that they were like, we've never heard men talk like this. But there's a thing called the European Society for Human Reproduction and Embryology, and they do a massive conference every year. It's like 11,000 delegates, like it's huge. And I showed the clip, and it was the clip about what it's like for the guys to go and give their sample.
Yeah.
And the first lady put her hand up, said, I'm involved with a whole bunch of clinics, and just watching that clip has made me realize that we are doing it all wrong for the men. And then the second one was this woman. She said, we've just created the largest clinic in Denmark, and we've got like 10,000 square feet of property. How much do you think we gave to the men? And I said, probably about 8 square feet. And she was like, yeah, about that.
Wow.
And I think it was just this realization of how skewed it was, that it was just like, all we need for the guys is just a small room with a TV and some magazines and a DVD player. And
they'll just do it. No big deal.
It's no problem.
Well, thank goodness you've created this for everyone in the community to process and see a different perspective. It's really something tremendous. And what better validation than the gentleman who was going home on the train and saying, you know, gosh, this was cathartic for me, or the medical community saying, wow, we can make some difference here.
Yeah, I did some follow-up interviews, and it was about a year after we'd filmed, maybe a year to 18 months after we'd filmed. One of the things that the guy said, I did a little interview with him, and he said the thing that doing the film taught him was that vulnerability makes you stronger.
That's actually been a recurring theme in many of the conversations I've had, both on and off the record. And this vulnerability thing, my God, is it a bitch? But it's helpful.
Yeah.
Makes you a better person. Now, let's talk about, you've said you've got these clips at the very end that talk about the aftermath or what happened to the couple. Let's talk about your own story, your own twist ending, so to speak.
Yeah, so we were kind of in this period of childless, not by choice. And something my wife had always suffered with was really, really excruciating period pain. Like, again, they could never figure out why. And after we'd done all the treatment, it was awful. And every month she was getting this incredibly physically painful and emotional reminder that we couldn't have kids. So we started to talk about her having a hysterectomy, and it would sort of essentially draw a line under everything. We went with a really lovely lady, but we went into this meeting. She went through all the medical history and she looked at everything and she said, okay, you sure you want to do this? And we said, yes. And she said, okay, well, looking at everything you've had done, the only procedure that my wife never had done is called a laparoscopy, where they use a camera to look at the womb from the outside to see if there's things like endometriosis. So she said, right, rather than doing the hysterectomy, why don't we use this sort of consultation to do a laparoscopy. And she said, and what we'll do is we'll have a look for endometriosis, and then what it will do is it will tick the what if box. It will tick that little box that's been left unchecked. And from there, you can move on. And she just quite offhandedly said, and I'll give you some steroids and some blood thinners. Try naturally for 3 months. And if nothing happens, you can have the hysterectomy and maybe get a dog. And we were just like, we were a bit dumbfounded, really, because I think we were at that point where, like, we were trying to come to terms with this grief. And we walked out of the thing in a lot of shock. And we were walking to the car. And I said to my wife, "Are you angry?" And she said, "Yeah. How dare she give us hope?" And it was just this, we were trying to get over it, and we were starting to be thrown back into it again. And it was just this, can we cope with this? But then also we were like, well, obviously we cannot turn down this opportunity to try. Like, we've been given this glimmer. Of course it's not going to come to anything, but you can't not do it, because then there'll be that what if.
One of my other guests calls that hope, that the medical field giving you hope. He calls it a Ponzi scheme, where you're borrowing hope from one place and you're replacing it, and sort of a house of cards. And yet, when somebody hands you this golden light of possibility, how can you not grab it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we said, okay, we'll go ahead. And she had a laparoscopy. So they did the laparoscopy. There was no sign of endometriosis. Like every other investigation, there was no sign of anything wrong. And she said to me, okay, here's some blood thinning medicine, go and try naturally for 3 months. So we did that, and a few weeks later my wife was due to have is it an endoscopy?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that process. It's a very uncomfortable process.
Yeah, so she was due to have that done. I mean, it's really not pleasant. And she got the paperwork through, and she was like, "Oh God!" And it was like, I was like, "What's wrong?" And it was just like, you need to make sure before you have the sedation / anesthetic or whatever it is that you're not pregnant. So you need to do a pregnancy test. And we were just like, "Oh, there's another slap in the face. You're going to have some procedure for something totally unrelated, yet you still have to go through having a pregnancy test to make sure." And it just shows you when somebody doesn't have all of the medical notes and how insensitive that can sometimes be. Like, for the clinicians doing that procedure, that's a required element, and it makes perfect sense. But to somebody on the receiving end who's going through that, it's traumatic to receive that letter.
Yeah, painful.
Yeah, so she went and did a pregnancy test, and I just heard this shrieking and swearing coming from upstairs. And she came down, and she had a positive pregnancy test in her hand. And
how exciting.
We were just completely dumbfounded.
What did you think? I mean, what was going through your mind?
I just don't know I didn't know what to think, because there was this immediate, like, euphoria, elation of like, how is it, like, this has happened? But then it was like, how has what she did worked? The consultant, well, how's that worked? But the
past
whole
15
IVF,
years,
like, why is, and genuinely to this day, we still don't know why.
And it was a successful pregnancy, right?
It went on to be a successful pregnancy, and we had a daughter in the end of 2016. So that all happened whilst I was filming the interviews for the Easy Bit. And it was just this bizarre, like, I've told this story on stage, like, to audiences and things like that. And I genuinely, like, now, right, sitting here right now, I feel a bit queasy. Like, I feel a bit faint, like, just thinking of the astronomical series of events that led to that moment that could have easily not happened, and the choices we made. I can't think about it too much, because it boggles my mind as to how close we came and how lucky we were, and and it's how fortunate we've been. Yeah.
To come that close and to really be at that point, not just of walking away, but making it an impossibility.
Yes.
And have this happen. It's just astounding.
Yeah. And after we had my daughter, my wife did then go on and she went back to the lady who had the hysterectomy, and we decided that was it. We were going to draw a line under it there and just sort of move on as the three of us. So
well, congratulations. It sounds really like a long journey, but with some really interesting endings, both with the documentary and with the ultimate success with your child.
Thank you.
So I have two follow-up or final questions.
Yeah, sure. That's fine. Yeah.
The first is that I am noticing this, I want to call it a pile or a pyramid of guitars. If I'm counting correctly, I see maybe 6 of them back there in the corner behind you. If you were to think about this 15-year journey, both the creation of the documentary and also the creation of your now daughter, if you were to put it in musical terms, do you have a playlist or a particular artist that would be the right backdrop for this experience?
So I was thinking about this, and it's really funny because it's like music is something that, I've always been very connected to.
Yeah.
But in terms of songs I would pick now, When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin, which is this like driving blues like rock thing, and like the opening drums to it is like this visceral sound, and it's just, to me, that sort of signified like the weight of emotion that you have and how releasing it or holding it in is key. And it was this kind of really like big sound. I also picked a song called Happy Together by the Turtles, which is something that my wife and I have always kind of loved. And then I picked the version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow by the Hawaiian ukulele. Israel, and I can't pronounce his surname.
It's the most beautiful song.
Yeah. So I kind of picked those three songs, and I'd probably add to that now Starman by David Bowie.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I picked that is because it has transpired. My daughter's just turned 4, and now she loves David Bowie. And she's like this 4-year-old that loves David Bowie. And she came home from school the other day, and she'd written on a piece of paper the Ground Control to Major Tom. And it was just like...
What an interesting song in the context of all the masculinity that we've been speaking about. It's sort of an emblematic song in some ways.
Yeah.
So one last question. This is the question I ask all of my guests. If you were to define family, or what family means to you, in a word or no more than a sentence, what would it be?
Everything.
Everything. Yeah,
that's what it means, I think. I think it's made me more conscious of things like my work-life balance. It's, I'm now not afraid to send an email saying someone, I'm sorry, I can't do this bit of work for you right now because I'm spending time with my family. It's made me reassess what's important and how I want to spend my time, basically.
Well, that's great. Now, we've talked a lot about the documentary, and there's so many compelling stories that you either teased or you started to share with us. For our audience who may be interested in finding and watching the documentary, where can they find it?
There are 2 easy ways to find it. There's Amazon Prime, and if you've got a Prime subscription, then it's free to watch. Or if you can't see it via Prime, you can get to it on Vimeo On Demand, where it's available for rental.
And if we wanted to find you, can we find you on social media?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have social media for the film itself. So on Instagram, it's @TheEasyBit. On Twitter, it's @TheEasyBitDoc. And there's a Facebook page, which is just facebook.com/TheEasyBit. And then I have personal accounts, which are Tom Webb Director on Instagram and Twitter.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for diving in deeply to both your story and the story of this documentary. I think we got to talk about some really interesting and rich topics, and really grateful for your time.
Yeah, thank you for your time as well. I mean, it's lovely to be on the show.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram @Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.